Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Today we're talking about Jan van Eyck, 1394, 1441, so a warm welcome. And we're talking about Van Eyck around Alfred Ecker's recent book, Jan van Eyck within his art. Jan van Eyck has somehow received a bad reputation from the 19th century onwards, when he was characterized as the so-called spearhead of the even more so-called Flemish primitives. And now the word primitive is not very much used, but the legacy seems to remain insofar as Van Eyck tend to be seen as a medieval painter, maybe the crowning of the Middle Ages, but still a medieval painter, rather than as the beginning of the Renaissance. In fact, in his time, he was pretty much considered avant-garde. He was, in fact, considered the leading artist of his time by humanist Bartolomeo Fazio, not only for his use and exploration of technique as well, but also for his use of optics. And these aspects had a considerable impact on another artist who changed the way representation takes place, that is Leonardo. Now, to discuss this much further and in much more detail, I am delighted to be joined by Alfred J. Akers, who is Wright Family Term Associate Professor and Interim Director of the Georgetown University Art Galleries. He has published on Renaissance art, on Renaissance invention, and the haunted infancy, which explore the image of death in images of Christ's infancy in the Netherlandish art. His interlocutor is Rembrandt Duits, Deputy Curator of the Photographic Collection, who has published extensively also on Northern Renaissance art, on velvet, on hell, and on the presence of Byzantine art in the Italian Renaissance, and who perhaps would like to ask the first question and begin the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Francois, and welcome everybody to this conversation. Yes, as you mentioned, Francois, already a century ago, when Van Eyck and the other 15th century Flemish artists were kind of rediscovered, they were labeled Flemish primitives, and that has stuck. And in a way, even when people later, like Panofsky, did serious research on Van Eyck and well, tried to uncover all the symbols in his painting. In a way, while he presented Van Eyck as a learned painter, it was still a form of learnedness that was kind of looking backward to Durande's interpretation of the church building, where every part meant something, or the speculum humanis salvationis, where the Old Testament is intricately connected to the New. So a sort of medieval form of learning rather than a Renaissance one. But Alfred, if I may, in your book, I mean, you're obviously interested in Renaissance invention, because that seems to be a recurring theme in your own work. And in your book, you present Van Eyck very much as the new artist. And in fact, the work that you really put central in that newness at the beginning of your book and on the cover is the supposed self-portrait in the National Gallery in London that we see now on the screen. So can you tell us more about this? How this work represents Van Eyck's newness?
I'd be happy to. And thank you, Rembrandt. Thank you also, Francois. I'm delighted to be here for this conversation. And take the opportunity, too, to thank Reaction Books, who published this book, of course, within the Renaissance Lives series, the invitation from Michael Lehman and from Francois to contribute to the series, which I had already admired. And thanks as well to the editorial and production people. Just a pleasure at every turn to work on this project. I appreciate the way you've set it up, moving away from that idea, of course, of the Flemish primitives, which no one that I know still says. That's a matter of sort of historiographic interest when we talk about this with our students and colleagues. I do recognize, though, that I have a probably invisible on the screen, a poster behind me from the milestone early 20th century exhibition of Les Primitives Flamands, precisely the most famous moment of debuting that kind of concept. But as you say, what I've tried to do here is to think more explicitly about Jan van Eyck as, I suppose I prefer not to think of it as an avant-garde, because that reads him backward through what's to come. Of course, that we know now that to do so sort of clouds the intentions within the moment of making things. Jan van Eyck was not thinking yet about Leonardo and ways in which they might harmonize with each other. But it's hard not to think about some of those parallels, right? Here, for example, I am convinced, as many people are, that this is indeed a self-portrait, although we have no explicit documentation external to the painting that quite confirms that for us. I believe there's plenty within that makes it an inescapable conclusion. So just to stick for a moment with your point about an avant-garde looking forward within the Renaissance, as it were, certainly this idea with this painting, the idea of an exceptional originality and ingenuity about what a portrait could be, what a portrait might look like, moving away, for example, from what was still a rather firm tradition of profile portraiture, to the extent that there were individual portraits of individuals in the preceding generations. Likewise, Jan van Eyck as an exceptionally prized court artist, as of course Leonardo would be in the 1480s and 1490s at the court of Milan. Both of them also as intellectual painters, for lack of a better term, and beyond painting, beyond picture making, the idea of their value, for example, at court being a matter of diplomacy in the case of Jan van Eyck, and many other things for Leonardo. So a couple of those parallels absolutely worth keeping in mind. But again, to whatever extent he was avant-garde, I think it's worth remembering that avant-garde artists are not always thinking about the après. They're not thinking about the artists to whom they seem to lead as we look back. That said, I do think that Van Eyck was unusually self-conscious, not just about his own powers of invention and his own powers of originality. I do think that he was also quite conscious about his identity, about the formulation of an identity as an artist with a capital A in the way that we think of artists, and within that, a sense of what we much later came to recognize as something called art history, right? His place in a history of artists. So with this self-portrait, as he would do on a number of his other paintings, he has included a rather elaborate signature. Important for us to remind ourselves that signatures were not standard fare in painting in the 1430s and the 1420s. There are certainly precedents. There are Italian precedents and a few northern ones as well. But this was a project for Jan van Eyck. He signs numerous works, probably more than survive. Some of the frames are gone because he typically signs on the frames. Different formulations of his name, different verbs, as we shall see. So in the case here, Jan van Eyck made me in the year 1433, 21st of October, 1433. I mention that because a sense of temporality, a sense of the moment of making or the period of making, and a sense even in some of his works, quite consciously, of a future from which they will be seen. The most famous example of this, Francois is ahead of me here. He sees where I'm going, to the Arnolfini portrait, painted a year later, 1434, with the, I think, still astonishing idea of a signature on the wall of these people's home. Jan van Eyck was here, 1434, in very elaborate script. This is not on the frame. This is within the fiction of the picture. That choice of the verb was here was a verb of being rather than doing. More typically, an artist signs as having made, having painted. He is thinking about the future of individuals looking back at this painting and thinking not just of him as the man who made something, but him as a person who was here. That's a long way of suggesting this idea. historical
interject briefly?
Please.
Yeah, is that also because we do find a lot of sgraffito also in medieval churches where people actually do say that such and such was here. Do you think that this is in any way related to that?
I would say related. I can't say more than related in the sense that it's the same kind of sentiment, right? To mark one's presence and to recognize that it will matter for subsequent observers, people who will be here in the future. I'm not sure how much he would have welcomed the comparison to sgraffiti in churches, but yes, the basic idea I think is similar.
If I may, he would have welcomed a comparison to Pliny, where a painter traces a line in the middle of the other line of the painter saying, I was there, therefore you can see my talent. It's just an observation.
Exactly right. One of the most beautiful stories that Pliny tells, painters competing who can make the more perfect line and leaving them as messages for each other. The first modern painting, perhaps, first abstract paintings, at least the way the story is told. I think, as many think, it's likely that Jan van Eyck knew some of those stories, knew those stories of the painters of antiquity, all of whose work was long gone, all of whose work was long gone when Pliny wrote about them. But the stories themselves are so compelling, stories of triumph and priority and primacy. There are some specific ways, and I think we'll get to them, some specific ways in which his paintings seem to pick up on that idea, another historical consciousness in his work about a history of art and artists. So a final point here, in including that signature on this painting, as he does on other paintings, more than any of his contemporaries would do, and including a motto at the top, even more remarkable, the motto being als ich kann, as I can, which was surely intended in the sense of, this is an old topos for scribes in manuscripts, as I can, as if to say, this, I did the best I could. I wish I could have done better, right? There's a kind of a false modesty in this. Artists did not typically have mottos. To have such a thing, to place it there at the top of the painting, and then to repeat it in other paintings. We have at least 4 paintings we know about with the motto. In these ways, and in some other ways too, you can say that Jan van Eyck was literally making a name for himself. Right? His name was being made in ways that he knew would carry beyond his workshop and his city to other places. Perhaps from there, while we have the Arnolfini portrait there for a moment more, Francois, more famous still than the inscription, the signature, the mirror just below, which most observers take to be a kind of a second signature, right? The idea that beyond the reflected couple, whom we would expect to see here, there are those 2 additional figures standing out here where we are standing, or where we are sitting, looking through our screens together, neither of whom has a face, neither of whom could be called a portrait in any conventional sense, but one of whom must be Jan van Eyck, one of whom must be the person who made this picture, who would have been, at least nominally, would have been standing here in order to create the picture that we look at. To the question of who else is there, who is the second person standing there, anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's. That might have been someone known to or understood between the painter and the owners of the painting, or it could be taken as almost any observer in the future, that future from which they look back at this Jan van Eyck who was here, right? So there too, an insertion not just of his name, but of his himself into paintings, which he does in other paintings as well. This is really kind of at the heart of the title of the book, Jan van Eyck within his art. We have a report, an early report, that in the Ghent altarpiece, which he had completed 2 years before the Arnolfini portrait, 1 year before the so-called man in the red turban, which I will call the self-portrait, that one of the many panels in the Ghent altarpiece, unfortunately the panel that was stolen in the 1930s, that it included portraits of Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert. Hubert having been the artist who initiated the work on the altarpiece, Jan having finished it. So he included himself there as well. Francois, may we look at the Van der Pelle Madonna for a moment, please?
Yes.
Here as well, an altarpiece from a few years later, 1436, for a church in Bruges, in the armor of St. George. St. George introducing Canon Joris van der Pelle. He is the name saint of Mr. van der Pelle. In the armor of St. George, thank you for finding that. I won't point because you can't see what I'm pointing at, but there it is, centered perfectly. Thank you, Francois. A reflection of a man with some sort of red headgear, distorted by the curve of the shield in which he appears, which must certainly be Jan van Eyck as well, having reflected himself again, as he had done in the Arnolfini portrait. Doing so in a way that is, on the face of it, extremely inconspicuous. This doesn't appear in the modern scholarship on Van Eyck, I believe, until the 1950s. This is a painting that did not lack for attention in preceding generations. Almost invisible unless you're looking for it, but of course, at the same time, once it's seen, once someone knows it's there, it is unforgettable. It is unforgettable. So sometimes, too, a kind of a tension between cleverness and a kind of coy sensibility within his work, and something that in the end winds up being exceptionally performative about his ideas and his powers.
I mean, one aspect of these reflections, which are very striking, both in the Arnolfini portrait and here, all the reflecting surfaces, of course, Van Eyck's amazing technique of painting, which surely exceeded anybody at that time in the degree of realism with which he was able to evoke textures of materials. I mean, Van Eyck was famously credited by Giorgio Vasari with having invented oil paint, which is, we now know, is well, at the very least, a conflation of what actually happened. Oil paint was, of course, used before, but it was clear that contemporaries did see his work as also in a very technical sense, something very new. And in your book, you do devote a whole chapter to technique, and maybe we can go to the next painting, which has a very rare surviving preparatory drawing for the portrait of the Cardinal Nicola Albergati. Francois, if you can find that one. It must be there earlier in the sequence. Here it is.
Thank you.
And that drawing has, among other things, very interesting annotations, doesn't it?
It does indeed. So yes, the second chapter of the book, I believe the second chapter, is called The Painter at Work. The idea being to try to step back to recognize just what it was, not just that Jan van Eyck, but his colleagues as early Netherlandish painting, how they did their jobs, how they ran their businesses, and how they made their pictures. So it proceeds from this drawing, the first stages of making a picture, on through painting technique, through materials, through negotiations with a patron, guild structures in cities that manage the business of painters and more as well. So the drawing on our left here, which lives in Dresden today, the only drawing on paper pretty much universally recognized, acknowledged to be an autographed drawing by the hand of Jan van Eyck. Certainly all of his paintings began from drawings. This one is, as most were, these preparatory drawings, it was produced in metal point. Metal point being, I suppose I can't quite say perfected, but coming into its own in the hands of these Netherlandish painters, these Flemish painters, in the first years, first decades of the 15th century in a way it had not done before. Very meticulous, very demanding form, because it is actually a metal stylus, so typically a silver stylus, drawn onto a prepared surface, usually paper, sometimes wood, sometimes vellum or other skin, in such a way that the metal oxidizes when it touches that surface and becomes a very fine line. The extraordinary scientific examination, the technical examinations that have been brought to bear on Jan van Eyck in recent decades have given us more knowledge than we even know what to do with in some cases. For this drawing, if I recall correctly, they have determined that he seems to have used at least 3 styli, a silver point, an alloy metal point, I believe copper and silver, and also a gold point stylus. And in fact, there are a number of other early Netherlandish drawings within the sphere of Jan van Eyck that combine gold point and silver point. We don't know what artists thought about the difference between the two, why they might have switched gears. But I do mention in the book that one sort of tantalizing example is a crucifixion drawing, a remarkable crucifixion drawing, not by Jan van Eyck's own hand, but in which a horse on Calvary, it's a crucifixion, a horse is defecating in silver point and urinating in gold, which tells us, at the very least, that artists thought about the difference between these tools. The inscriptions, the annotations that that Rembrandt is talking about here, invisible or almost invisible in the view we have right now, very fine annotations to the left that are descriptions of color. They are color notes, talking, for example, about a purplish wart on his face, talking about a little bit of dark yellow around the pupils of the eyes, and around that a whitish blue circle, which in fact does translate into the final painting. What's assumed to have happened here is that Jan van Eyck made that drawing at the Congress of Arras in 1435. This was a very high-stakes diplomatic summit, really, a political summit. Jan van Eyck was there as a member of the Burgundian delegation, essentially a diplomatic attaché for Duke Philip the Good. Presumably, he had a brief portrait sitting with the exceptionally powerful Cardinal Niccolo Albergati, who was a papal legate at the conference. He would have known that he didn't have enough time to make a painting there. He made a drawing, he took notes on color, went back to his studio, or so we imagine, and got to work on the painting. So it's absolutely extraordinary, not just that we have the drawing, but that we have the drawing and the painting that came from it. In fact, I can add before we move on, one other thing that's been recognized among our scientific colleagues who have figured out so much about this. They are different sizes. The drawing is smaller than the panel. So there's, of course, always the question of what kind of transfer was made. How did he make that translation? And it appears that he used a divider, which is a kind of a compass-like instrument that allowed him to make the proportional translation from the paper to the panel, in order to maintain the proportions from the portrait sitting.
Right. I mean, one of the things you also mentioned in the book is that it is remarkable that of the surviving acknowledged, recognized works by Van Eyck, I think all of them stem from about 1 decade, which must have been about the last decade of his life. And in fact, the earliest known, well, securely attributable and dated work is probably also his greatest masterpiece, the Ghent Altarpiece. And we've been talking so far about the newness of Jan van Eyck, but this is a work that truly in almost every single respect is new and unique. There's nothing like
it. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And as you say, our earliest securely dated surviving work by Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert, about whom more in a moment. 1432, and I'll say a word about the inscription in a moment. We don't know when Jan van Eyck was born. I believe Francois said 1394. That's a possibility. Sometimes it's suggested a little bit earlier, perhaps closer to 1390. But assuming that's in the ballpark, assuming that's approximately when he was born, this is work finished around the age of 40 for Jan van Eyck, and it's the earliest we have, the earliest we know about for sure with a date. So it is very tantalizing to wonder what he must have been doing, what kind of work he might have been producing in the 1420s. The inscription, the famous inscription on the Ghent altarpiece, it's on the exterior frame. If we could see the exterior for a moment, please, Francois. The closed, I should say the closed polyptych. It is hinged. There it is, thank you. Across the bottom 4 frames, you see the donors, Jos Veit and his wife Elizabeth Borluut, on flanking the 2 illusionistically painted statues, St. John the Baptist. This was his church, Church of St. John in Ghent, and John the Evangelist beside him. You can see the inscription down there. The first line of the inscription indicates that I should be careful trying to quote this from memory. I won't try to quote it from memory, but the first indicates that the work was begun by Hubert van Eyck, than whom no man was greater. Okay, Hubert being Jan's elder brother. The second line indicated that Jan van Eyck finished the work, and in fact characterizes Jan van Eyck as second in art, second to his brother Hubert. The third line names the patron, Jos Veit, and the fourth line invites you to see what has been done, and it gives the date of May 6th, 1432. Extraordinarily, that date, the year 1432, is actually not written as such, but you can see, if we could hold that detail just for a moment, you can see that some of those letters are painted in red, not black. The letters that are painted in red, if they are read as Roman numerals and add up to 1,432, 1432 being the year in which the altarpiece was completed. That's a chronogram. That's a very sophisticated way, a clever, kind of showy way to indicate a date. And that sets a tone for an awful lot of linguistic play in the work to come. Jan van Eyck loved puns. He loved a kind of intellectual play within the inscriptions. And in fact, this dimension of his work, the linguistic dimension, is something I spend quite a bit of time on in the book. It's the sort of thing that, among other attractions and other functions, is very engaging, the sort of thing that would draw in not just the patrons, but all other visitors to the chapel in which this work appeared. Many more texts above. I will pass over the inscriptions, the prophets and sibyls up there in the top elements, sort of the attic of the altarpiece. And I should say too, the entire structure, as Rembrandt was saying, the entire structure of this enormous altarpiece, which is about 15 feet long, is completely unprecedented. So there's the writing up there as if written in ink on paper on those scrolls. There are...
Perhaps it's also worth mentioning just the fact that there are prophets and sibyls here. So a combination that we know, of course, much better from later Italian Renaissance works, but which is already here.
Indeed. In fact, it's something I commented on a little bit in these pages. Exactly that. The combination of prophets and sibyls, we associate that with the Sistine ceiling above all, literally above all, I suppose. But here they are combined in this Gothic chapel in Ghent, a century before, almost a century before. And in fact, likewise, I didn't mean to talk about these figures, but the sibyl on the left includes language. The Latin of her language is drawn from Virgil. We don't expect Jan van Eyck, a Flemish painter in the 1430s, to be drawing upon Virgil in an altarpiece, right, an ecclesiastical work. There are even words here from a verse in Virgil that is the same one drawn upon by Raphael in the Stanza della Segnatura, in the figure of poetry above those frescoes. So really extraordinary to think of that kind of, I won't call it an anticipation, but an earlier inkling of that sort of idea. Perhaps we could also look at the window just below. One of the things that, to my mind, is most striking about the entire altarpiece, and you can already tell, we could go on forever about this altarpiece. People have gone on forever about this altarpiece, is the way that it structures the very specific relationship of observers in the actual space of the chapel to what happens inside. For example, we know that the light, as it falls, the consistency of the light as it falls onto these images would have corresponded to the window in the chapel. Jan van Eyck and Hubert van Eyck, who began this work, were not the first painters to do this. We have Florentine painters doing the same thing in the same decade. The Brancacci Chapel in Florence, we see something similar happening. But these two painters, and I'm going to say primarily Jan, I'm just an instinct here, are much more assertive about that kind of, it's an almost permeable membrane at the picture surface between inside and outside. The shadows that fall in the middle tier between Mary and Gabriel in the Annunciation, the shadows that fall onto that floor are cast by the frame. They are cast by the actual frames of the paintings, right? That means that the light behind you, as you stand in the chapel looking at this painting, the light that's on your back is the same light that's casting a shadow into the painting. Just an extraordinary way to think about the openness of the relationship, the contingency of your relationship to what you see. And I think in that window beyond, which is easy for us to think of as kind of a nice little bit of filler, sort of realistic filler, and sometimes we too easily default to realism as an explanation of what's happening in Jan van Eyck paintings. It's actually much more than that. To be able to look out the window between Mary and Gabriel onto a street like the one outside the church, it looks like a Flemish city in the 1420s and 1430s. There are people walking around back there having conversations. There are birds wheeling in the sky. And there's a very striking sawtooth pattern on the street. I don't know if you can get any closer there, Francois. Just past the column on the left, in the left window. That pattern on the street, it takes you a moment to realize it. That is the shadows cast by the roof line on your left, right? So he tells you precisely where the sun is. It seems to be early morning or mid-morning or perhaps mid-afternoon. That absolute specificity that connects, again, your reality to the reality of the sacred figures. When the altarpiece was opened, and what we assume about this is what we assume about most hinged northern altarpieces, of which there were many, triptychs and polyptychs. It is generally assumed that most days they were closed. The exterior that we were just looking at would have been the standard view. And on special days, perhaps feast days of the church, perhaps Sundays, other holidays, and later when distinguished visitors would come to see the work, as if to a museum, clearly, in some cases. It was a complete transformation. What had been on most days on the exterior, these kind of shadowy enclosures, the niches across the bottom with individual figures, the relatively muted palette of the Annunciation, there is this explosion of color and an entirely different kind of vision inside the work. Again, two tiers. You have heaven, God above, flanked by the Virgin and John the Baptist. Again, this is John the Baptist's church, as it were. Musical angels beyond them, and then the first parents flanking, these extraordinary nudes of the first parents flanking, in a way that's, among other things, really quite poignant. their complete separation from each other, but looking inward in a way that also has a kind of a narrative component about it. Eve making her offer, Adam seeming to contemplate her offer. They are not just symbols of original sin. There is a kind of connection across that space that makes the theology of it that much more resonant.
Is it also a connection to almost to the outside of the altarpiece, that Adam and Eve are the only figures who appear in stone niches, while the others appear in an illusionistic space?
I think in a way it is. I think that's a good point, not least because the two saints presented as statues on the exterior, at the bottom of the exterior, they are, of course, in niches. They are also distinguished by being statues rather than breathing humans, right? This, too, is a part of Jan van Eyck's historical consciousness, making temporal distinctions across history, right? This is one way of doing that. But again, while we have this here, at the bottom, you see that those pedestals are pressed precisely up against the threshold of the frame. And if we can get a little bit closer to that, one of the things I think that these statues would have been among the most dazzling things to contemporary viewers. Those of us who look at early Netherlandish paintings recognize this as a rather familiar idea, to have what are sometimes called grisaille figures or trompe-l'oeil statues on the exterior of an altarpiece. It was not standard fare in 1432. This would have been an early example of such an idea. Those two statues stand directly above the part of the inscription below, the original inscription signing the altarpiece, that indicate Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck as second in art, as having completed the work. I think it's remarkable that he gives priority to his brother Hubert, than whom none is greater. But he has also found a way, in the way that he signed, the way that he carved those two pedestals, Johannes Baptist, Johannes Evangelist. He has the name Jan 3 times there. The name Hubert appears only once in the altarpiece, but the name Jan appears 3 times, as if thrice signing. And I think particularly proud of those statues. And then the famous lower tier of the altarpiece, and there continues to be a lot of inquiry and debate about how this whole thing came to be. What did Hubert do? What did Jan do? There have been some oversimplified hypotheses about this. One of the important ones that remains very much in play is that the adoration of the Lamb, which is the subject that occupies the 5 panels across the bottom tier. The idea that this was Hubert van Eyck's original project, that he may have left unfinished when he died in 1426. And for whatever reason, when Jan van Eyck inherited or took up the project, expanded the work, whether that might have been on the order of a patron or for some other reason, he made it something very different. This subject, which has been recognized as a conception, a very original conception of an old idea, the liturgy of all saints, a specific celebration of convergence, a heavenly convergence of all saints around the altar, the Lamb on the altar, hence one of the titles of the entire altarpiece being the altarpiece of the Lamb, the adoration of the Lamb. But here too, worth recognizing that, again, looking beyond or within the realism, the theology of this, the sophistication of the theology is really kind of overwhelming. That blood pours, that blood splashes into a chalice on the altar. And by the way, while we have this excellent detail, one of the not just discoveries, recoveries of the conservation project that is still underway in Ghent on the altarpiece, this part of the altarpiece has been completed, was the revelation a few years ago. They removed overpaint on the face of the Lamb. 16th century conservators, well-intentioned, changed the face of the lamb. They made it a little sort of smoother and a little bit more perhaps animal-like. Observers were really startled when they saw this much more intense gaze of the lamb out of the image. So the blood pours into the chalice. And if we can pan back a little bit, please, Francois, actually splashes onto the surface of the altar. Angels with instruments of the Passion surrounding. And if we can come back further still, below, closer to the threshold of the altarpiece and closer to the real altar in the church, a fountain of life. There is a sense of literally fluid motion from the splashing of the blood into the chalice, the water of life splashing very vividly, really audibly into the basin of this fountain. And then, to my mind, perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the entire altarpiece, below the basin, a small opening, a small channel opened. The water pours out and into a channel that has been cut into the ground, into the grass, so that that water that begins above with the blood pours out of the altarpiece as if onto the altar before which you stand, right? There could not be a more, not just conceptual, but actually physical connection between the painting, the message of the painting, and those who come to the altar before it.
And if I may, I guess there's also an olfactory connection with the angel swinging these incense, which connect with what happened in a church, I would imagine.
Exactly right. Exactly right. To my mind, one of the other really remarkable things and different things about the Ghent altarpiece is the extent to which it is the most ecclesiastical of altarpieces. And by that, I mean, of course, plenty of altarpieces belong in churches. Most of them do, but in the sense that this is about the church itself, the foundation of the church itself, and about what happens at the altar. Really doctrinal rather than devotional, to the extent that we can separate doctrine and devotion in a way that many other works of this period were not.
Now, you mentioned earlier the two statues on the outside of the altarpiece, the simulated statues. A lot of Van Eyck's work, I mean, yes, we shouldn't simplify it to realism, but at the same time, simulation of things was one of his real skills. But he also has a work that, well, as far as we know it, only consists of two of these simulated statues, the Annunciation that is in the Thyssen collection. Maybe we can move on to that one.
Great, thank you. So that Annunciation, the illusionistic statues, and the Annunciation next to it, the Washington, D.C. Annunciation, those are the anchors of a chapter called Annunciations and Other Encounters. Jan van Eyck paints several Annunciations, but this chapter is also an opportunity to write a little bit more about that larger idea of how he conceives connection itself, engagement with viewers and engagement within paintings. So the diptych we're looking at there on the right, two panels, quite small. It's about 15 inches tall. As you say, in Madrid in the Thyssen collection. If I'm recalling correctly, this is one of the relatively recent additions to the Van Eyck canon. I believe this came from the art market in the 1930s, give or take, perhaps a decade, with little or no provenance. We have no idea for whom or for where this was made. No one doubts that it is the work of Van Eyck. So the subject itself, the Annunciation, could hardly have been more canonical, could hardly have been more familiar. But here he painted it as if every single thing you see is stone. It is not just as if those two figures are stone statues, which indeed is the fiction that he has created. He has also painted a very convincing stone frame around them, right? And of course, in doing so, created an opportunity for himself to have a trompe l'oeil, an illusionistic departure from within the image, right? The wing of Gabriel actually overlapping what would appear at first to be the frame of the picture.
That and another remarkable aspect here is that the statues actually do reflect in the background, the simulated stone background.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I can't keep saying one of the most remarkable things, but you have to say that when you're looking at these paintings, right? At first glance, it is very easy to see that as just a neutral black background, the sort of thing we see, for example, in many individual portraits, including Van Eyck portraits. A second glance, a second take, recognizes that that is polished black stone. And it has been recognized, I think, very convincingly that this should be recognized as Jan van Eyck being a very early thinker about what would come later to be known as the paragone in Renaissance art. The paragone being the idea of a competition between different arts, between painting and poetry, especially between painting and sculpture. We think of this especially in the time of Titian and Michelangelo and Leonardo, generations later. People were writing about it by the 16th century. We don't have people writing about it in the 1430s, but one of the topoi, one of the ideas in the paragone debate was sculptors saying, we can show the entire figure. We can show something in 3 dimensions, fully realized, literally realized. Painters can't. Painters, and some in the 16th century come up with something similar, painters, and I think Van Eyck first and foremost said, I can show you the back and the front at the same time. I can reflect the back of this figure. It is really...
If I may add something, it's really something that shows that Van Eyck was a court artist, because if you read Castiglione, one of the typical court debate is the paragon, and precisely Leonardo was involved in that, contribute to the paragon. So I can imagine some kind of debate taking place like this at the Burgundian court. Or would you agree with that suggestion?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think more generally, I think one of the important ways of thinking about Jan van Eyck's realism, without simplifying it as a kind of a reflex of the early Renaissance, is to recognize that, especially at courts, precious, labor-intensive, dazzling realism was highly valued at courts more than anywhere else. Even the very idea of the amount of time it takes to be able to do such a thing. And of course, we see at various courts in between Leonardo and Jan van Eyck. Think of the illusionism, for example, in the Palazzo Ducale at Mantua, the Camera Picta, right? Comprehensive illusions for courts. That is an abiding idea, and I have no doubt that the court aspect is an important part of what's going on there, part of the fuel for that.
At courts, one of the things that people liked were, well, it can descend into practical jokes, but they did like deceptiveness, things that would deceive the viewer in the same way that in classical anecdotes, painters were deceived by each other's skills with painting simulated flies and that sort of.
That's right, and we have famous accounts of feasts, of celebrations, pageants at the Burgundian court. We assume that Jan van Eyck participated as a court artist would have done. He wouldn't have just made panel pictures. He probably would have made ephemeral works as well, perhaps painting banners, perhaps polychroming statues, but probably also what we might think of as stage design, right? Or the production of the events themselves. Some of which included, as you say, things like jokes, like hidden water that would spray up on people and become a kind of a game.
Now, one of the things that you also already mentioned with the Gentles piece was the view through the window. With Francois just zoomed by in the Rollin, the Virgin with the Chancellor Rollin. But surely one of the things that Van Eyck really contributed to painting was this view of a background landscape that I don't think any artist had done before to that extent. I mean, there are some crude mountains that you see in earlier paintings that simulate a landscape, but this kind of panoramic, realistic view of a landscape disappearing into a blue distance. That surely is something that Van Eyck did for the first time.
I agree. And I think we could agree, for example, that if we were to take just the rectangle at the center of this screen, between those two columns, between the garden wall and those mountaintops, if that painting had produced, if that view had been produced just as a view unto itself, it would have made the fame of any other painter, if that were the sole work surviving from that painter.
Absolutely.
Right? So it is one of the accomplishments, and certainly all of this very conscious accomplishments of Jan van Eyck, not just to be able to do this, but to be able to do it in the background, in the distance. The distances of Jan van Eyck are among the most durable and no doubt compelling of his accomplishments. The fact that something so remarkable and important is happening in the foreground, the Chancellor in prayer. This is Chancellor Nicolas Rolin, perhaps the second most powerful man in the Duchy of Burgundy, sort of a right-hand man to the Duke, fantastically wealthy, that he has an audience with the Virgin and Child. He is in prayer in a very lavishly realized chamber. People have tried maybe harder than they should to try to define what that chamber is. He is receiving the blessing of Christ, who holds an orb with the cross indicating his dominion, right? He is the Salvator Mundi, he is the world savior. So that's pretty good if you are Chancellor Rolin, that you've got that. But that landscape beyond, which we call background, the very idea of backgrounds and foregrounds is, in a sense, coming into being in these years. Without that background, such as we call it, there is no foreground. There's no distinction between here and there. So there, too, it is a kind of consciousness about palpable relationship between where you are, what you see, and what's happening. Likewise here, and Van Eyck does this in many of his paintings, the distance allows him also to create surface conjunctions and relationships that seem incidental, but of course are not at all. The fact that that blessing is carried across the river by that bridge, as if directly to Chancellor Rolin, right? The space and the structures, the sort of formal structures of the image become part of the machine of the meaning, the prayer, and everything else that this is about. This painting is also, without question, about the wealth of Nicolas Rolin. He is gazing across toward the Virgin and Child, but he's also gazing across vineyards. Part of his family wealth in Burgundy, this painting was made for his hometown of Autun, for Notre Dame du Châtel, we know the church. They had vineyards, part of his wealth, and the vineyards are there almost like a terrestrial halo for him, just as the Christ child has a halo of churches and towers, right? An ecclesiastical, incidental, but not incidental at all, halo in the world.
And you mentioned earlier, of course, Van Eyck's self-consciousness about his accomplishment, but in this case, he may actually be one of the two figures looking out at his own accomplishment.
I'm among those who believe that one of these two men, probably the one, again, with the red headgear, is Jan van Eyck. Again, if so, a kind of sly presence. You could scarcely call it a portrait. We have just a little bit of a profile there. He might not have needed much more than that. Certainly, Chancellor Rolin would have understood if that were the intention. But one of the other things that most interests me here is the idea of having a figure, and he does this in other paintings as well, having things in these paintings that insist on more of the world inside the painting, a greater fullness of realism, than we can even see. That person in the black hat sees much more landscape. It's tantalizing. There's more down there. There must be. And Jan van Eyck makes us collaborate with him to understand that there is more of the picture that he, in a sense, has created without actually creating it. One idea suggested long ago that I would love to believe is that the person looking down, seeing something that we can't see, seeing something that Jan van Eyck can't see, that might be Hubert, a greater man than whom cannot be found, who is now gone, has been gone since 1426.
Now, you said as well that you don't want to keep using the word remarkable, even though it actually applies to almost every single aspect of every painting. But a work that is truly, again, unique in its conception is another painting that you deal with in the next chapter of your book, the Saint Barbara in front of her tower. If we can go to that one, yes, here she is. Which is again painted a bit like a grisaille, but also in a sense to look like almost like the drawing that we saw earlier.
That's right. So I will refrain from saying remarkable or astonishing or incredible, and I just did say them. This is another small picture. I was about to say a painting. It is kind of a painting. It is a drawing. And it's something else. And nobody's completely sure what he had in mind here. So this one, I'm going to say it's about 7 inches tall. If we could pan back for a moment, please, Francois. Here too, the frame is a part of the picture. The frame, and this was typical at the time, when a painter began a panel painting, the frame was already present. It was a part of the work. So the frame is painted as if carved stone, as if marble, as is the case for many of his frames. It is signed across the bottom. Jan van Eyck made me in 1437. One of the things that I find remarkable here is that this is a picture of a saint, Saint Barbara, who is nowhere named in the image. Her name is not here, but the artist's name is here. This is in a chapter called Situating Saints. I focus on 3 paintings of individual saints, 3 very small paintings as it happens. So there's the Barbara, a St. Francis, and a St. Jerome. Some questions about attribution, but certainly Eyckian paintings, each of which uses these capacities we've been talking about to give you not just an identity, not just a saint, but a world and a story. The idea of fleshing out that which makes saints, right? So here it is the story of Barbara having been locked in a tower. She asked that a 3rd window be added to the tower to represent the Holy Trinity. Her father, as various versions of the legend have it, turns her over to the authorities, right? He does not approve of her faith. Plenty of images of St. Barbara, very popular saint in the late Middle Ages, and very often with the tower as an attribute, a tower that looks like a toy, a dollhouse next to her or in her hands, right? Just an attribute. That's not for Jan van Eyck. That's not how he thinks. He saw an opportunity here to have construction, to depict a construction site. And I'm going to guess that contemporaries in the 1430s, just as we do, probably find it much more captivating to spend time back there behind the saint, looking at what's going on, just as we look at construction sites today. People hauling materials. There's a gentleman over there on the left stepping into the interior. Just to the left of him, you see a group of people pointing at something, perhaps marveling at something that we can't see. Another part of Jan van Eyck's thought about what's elsewhere, what's around the corner that must be there, but in fact is not there. To the right of Barbara, our right of Barbara, there is a group that seems not to be a part of the construction crew. We could go a little further down. You can see 3 aristocratic women there and a man with them. They're not hauling rocks. They're not doing any carving. They're not making sculptures or piers. They're surely significant figures. We don't know who they were meant to be. I would like to believe that there were specific people, perhaps contemporaries. I would like to believe that it's not impossible that the man who looks out, seems to make eye contact with us, or to be looking up into the foreground, that might be Van Eyck or somebody he knew, right? If you pan back to the entire view, you recognize that that man appears at the bottom of a very prominent vertical axis that descends from the top of the painting, which is the base of the crane that they're using to haul materials, right? That pier, look at how sharp that stripe is. It goes directly down to that man. And if you trace it further to the bottom of the image, it also corresponds to the word fake it in the signature, which means made. I would love to believe that Jan van Eyck was playing again with the idea of his own presence. And certainly within this image, it's an image of St. Barbara, sure, but this is an image of making. This is an image of the work of creating something. In this case, architecture in progress. And some of his signatures are actually quite thoughtful, creative about the idea of the process of making. I've already touched upon that. The top of the tower touches the top of the picture. There's more to come. It will go beyond the picture. I'd even like to think of this in terms of Jan van Eyck's motto, als ik kan, as I can, as I was able to do, but I would have done better, almost as if there's more to come, right? More to come at the top of that tower. And we see the moon there. I haven't mentioned this, but Jan van Eyck's nature is beyond the nature of any other painter before him, including moons in multiple paintings, different aspects of the moon, sometimes perhaps symbolic and sometimes perhaps because it's the moon. No one had ever painted it like that before.
Well, I think on this note, it is time to, to open the conversation to the audience. So I suggest if you want to use the chat, send me the question, and I will pass it to Al. Or otherwise, you can use the raise hand option, and then I will unmute you, and then you'll ask your question directly. But I think there was already a question in the chat, which was about the source of that fascinating anecdote you mentioned about piecing gold, and that horse that was connected so much to medium. I have to find the chat again. Let me.
So actually, not an anecdote. In fact, that is a finding from the technical examinations of the drawing.
Exactly. To come back to the correct question, it was a horse defecating in silver point and urinating in gold, because it reminds me, for instance, of a Baxendale analysis of St. Francis throwing his tunic, which was made in lapis lazuli. So there is that connection between the narrative and the medium. And so if you could comment on that and give us the source.
I would love to be able to connect it to that, to Baxendale's point. I suspect that this is a much more humble kind of thing. First of all, the drawing itself, which we don't have here, I don't think it's by the hand of Jan van Eyck, but it got a lot of attention beginning about 5 years ago. It's been around for a long time.
Okay.
It is an exceptionally packed image of the crucifixion that's been related convincingly to the Jan van Eyck diptych in New York in the Metropolitan Museum, which includes a very busy crucifixion, all kinds of things going on, including a moon. That's one of the connections to Jan van Eyck. At any rate, the finding about the silver versus the gold, that is a matter of the scientific analysis, the material analysis of this drawing that was able to reveal those two styli being used. Whether it had meaning, my guess is that that might have been a kind of a private joke or a play on the part of the artist, whoever the artist was.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Claudia Vedepol. Hello, good evening, Claudia.
Hi, François. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks a lot for that very vivid presentation. I've got a question which actually it goes back to ages ago when I was studying. I was taught that Hubert van Eyck was phantom, that it was only so he was basically put into the in the inscription to aggrandize Jan van Eyck's sort of persona and the city itself, that he, the sort of greatest painter, is only the second of the two. So where are we with that? And sort of with the question if there's an oeuvre of Hubert van Eyck. If you could say a little bit more on that, that would be interesting.
Thank you. It's a great question. And you used the word phantom. I think someplace in the book I've called him a phantom too, but not. I don't believe that Hubert is fictional, as has sometimes been proposed. I think he was very real. Part of the hypothesis that you're describing had to do with the idea that the inscription itself might have been a later addition, that the inscription might have been conjured. It might have been, for example, one of the ideas is that they wanted to make this a painting, a famous work of art by a Ghent artist, not a Bruges artist. Jan van Eyck was based primarily at the court in Bruges, came to Ghent to do this, and Hubert had been working in Ghent for years before he died. That's one of the ideas there. The recent exceptionally careful and revealing analyses concluded, to the satisfaction of my colleagues who know much more about this than I do, that the inscription is original, that the inscription was applied in 1432 or not long thereafter, which I think makes it hard to dismiss Hubert as a historical presence. Some of you may know, Claudia, and others may too, the quatrain itself, those 4 lines, have received more attention than the entire careers of any number of artists whom we admire greatly.
But there's no further attribution of any painting to Hubert.
There is not. However, again, the colleagues working most closely on this have begun to publish findings that suggest a more convincing distinction of hands within the paintings, right? So the first theories about this, some of the better known ones are the simpler ones. Some would say, well, maybe Hubert did the underdrawings and then Jan van Eyck came and painted the panels. That's not convincing. Maybe Hubert made the frames, which would have been really quite elaborate, probably a larger structure than we have now. And Jan made the paintings, also probably not convincing. But within the paintings themselves, it's been quite difficult to parse different hands until recently. I suspect there's going to be a lot more debate about the specific conclusions that are being made, but I think this is the level with the kinds of microscopes that they're using and pigment analysis that they're using. This is the level at which some of those results might be convincing, if not completely conclusive, in the years ahead.
Okay, thank you.
If I can just add to that, Claudia, yes, there is no other work known by Hubert van Eyck. But then there is no secure work by Jan van Eyck before the Ghent altarpiece either. Nothing survives that we can attribute with certainty. So the fact that things are lost doesn't necessarily mean that the artist didn't exist.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good point. And let me be clear. We have other records of Hubert. We have other mentions of work by Hubert. That's a very important point. And there are other paintings that have been floating around the literature and real paintings that we know that people have occasionally proposed as work by Hubert. There's a painting in Rotterdam of the Three Marys at the tomb that often gets pulled into these speculations. I think maybe not convincingly. It's a wonderful painting, but Hubert remains a mystery. This is another point made in the book. One of many mysteries, really, about Jan van Eyck. There is something pervasive about these these tantalizing questions, not least of which includes the missing panel from the Ghent altarpiece, which continues to fascinate people endlessly.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions from the chat. One from Richard Herbert. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. On Monday of this week, Dr. Stephen Camperdick presented a paper at the Courtauld Institute that explained that the double portrait could not be related to the Arnolfini family, and one was, in his view, a self-portrait and his wife, of the artist and his wife. Thus, by implication, denying that the National Gallery self-portrait is of Van Eyck. How would you view this, and how would this change your perception of Van Eyck? But I suspect you might disagree. But I'm listening. We're listening.
It's hard for me to disagree with Stefan Camperdick, who is among the giants of scholarship on this material. I did not hear that talk. I have not read his work on that. Some of you will know that the theories continue to proliferate. We do continue to learn new things about that painting. The longtime identification of Mr. Arnolfini as Giovanni di Arrigo Arnolfini was dismantled a couple of decades ago by Lauren Campbell. It's a cousin. It's a different Giovanni Arnolfini, different wife. The best guess, to my mind, the best theory about the wife, and I realize I'm ignoring Dr. Camperdick's thesis here for a moment, is that the additional problem was that even if this was Giovanni di Niccolao Arnolfini, as would seem to be the case, his wife had died in 1433, the year before the painting was signed. So one of the really very intriguing suggestions has been that it is a posthumous portrait of his wife. Nice. And more to be said about that. If Stefan Camperdick is right, and I look forward to reading and hearing more about this, it changes a lot. It changes a lot. There is, as some here may know, an individual portrait of the man in the Arnolfini portrait, in the Arnolfini double portrait. So there is the same man appears in a small headshot, as it were, in Berlin. So we have always called him Arnolfini as well, based on analogy to the painting. We don't have to start from square one, but we would have to start from square 2 or 3 in order to rethink what that's all about, including who's in that mirror.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that your this conversation highlighted is that he seems to appear in his picture as the guy with a red dot on his head, and that brings a sense of humor from the man with the turban to all these little figures in the background that you will notice because they were a red dot, I mean a red turban. But anyway, that I understand that still is a matter for discussion. Let me go to another question. In the group of the churchmen from Dennis Waddleworth, in the group of churchmen in the Adoration of the Lamb, it looks as though one of the figures is wearing a Pope's headgear. Might that be a portrait of the Pope of the time, or is it a generic pontiff? And I guess by extension are these pictures of ecclesiastic pictures of real church dignitaries, or mainly of their extremely expensive clothes?
Thank you for that question. That has been suggested. I find it very difficult to know how to test that hypothesis, that there is one or that there are more than one portraits, perhaps among those individuals. Sometimes with painters, individuals in a crowd stand out as having been registered and conceived in a way that must be a portrait, different from the other figures. Jan van Eyck creates a problem for us by being able to distinguish all of these people in ways that can look portrait-like, even those who must not have been portraits. I think it's possible. I just don't know how to do so, but it would, of course, square with the idea of the extent to which this is a painting about the church with a capital C, not just the Church of St. John in Ghent, now St. Bavo, later dedicated to St. Bavo. I think it's very possible. There are other Netherlandish paintings in these years in which the same sorts of suggestions have been made, where we are seeing portraits of members of court or ecclesiastics as faces in a crowd, as it were. I would say too, on the other side, in the group of the pre-Christian blessed, to our left of the altar, one of the extraordinary figures over there who have a much more varied set of attire and headgear, right? In the center, in white, if we can go a little further back to the central panel.
Oh, yeah. I go through.
That best guess is that the man in white is Virgil. Mentioned some of the words from Virgil in the hands of one of the sibyls on the exterior of the altarpiece. Again, a completely remarkable idea that Virgil might be included here among the pre-Christian blessed, which is to say the prophets and others born before grace, born before Christ.
Well, that implies someone who has read Dante, surely. I mean, not only Dante, obviously, but certainly with the poem on the Sibyl. Following many years ago, Rembrandt seminars, I was made aware that, for instance, in the Chancelier Rollin or other pictures, for every square inch, it represents about 1 year of the salary of a stonemason. And when I look at we were looking at the Ghent altarpiece, there's a big contrast between the simplicity of these early Christian guys and the extremely expensive habits of the ecclesiastic. It seems to anticipate a little bit the spirit of the Reformation. Maybe Van Eyck was connected to the Devotion Moderna, but do you have any comments on Van Eyck and his religion in that respect?
It's a very interesting question. This place and this period, as you're suggesting, we would expect that. We would expect him to be very much in tune with the modern devotion, with a new simplicity and a directness of one's engagement with God. It hasn't been. It has not been a prominent part of the scholarship about Van Eyck's religious paintings. All of the scholars who work on Van Eyck know very well about that tradition. And there are ways in which some of that becomes drawn into the speculations. But I do tend to think that the kind of attention that he is inviting, that he is demanding with this kind of realism, is a different kind. To my mind, when we're talking about paintings that subscribe to or promote the modern devotion or these kinds of devotions, I think it's less in these years about meticulous realism and intensity of realism, and I think it's more about the structuring of images and the selection of subjects. I think, for example, of the German panel paintings, the Man of Sorrows paintings by Meister Franke, for example. In these same years, they're relative. It's not a whole lot of realism, but it's a kind of intensity of encounter that I think might have been more geared toward prayer. I think there's something different going on in this language.
Okay, James has a question, but before there's one in the chat that was before. So the question from Alison: do you agree that an inscription which speaks to the reader, as in Van Eyck made me, is in itself a way of projecting realism, as the work itself is addressing its audience, as if the audience was alive?
Yes. In a word, yes. Now, he wasn't the first to phrase it that way, but he did so more persistently than any of his predecessors, of whom we know. Again, I think that's the point that you're making, Alison, is amply affirmed by the other versions of that kind of connective consciousness, of the presence of the viewer. I am part of the play too. Is the fact that his motto is in the present tense. His motto doesn't say "as I could." It says, as I can. So I think there's a consciousness there also of a kind of projective consciousness and not to sound too modern about it, but a kind of a kinship with the viewer, a shared presence with the viewer, as might be the case in that mirror, whoever is standing in the back of that mirror. He says in the Arnolfini double portrait, Jan van Eyck was here, and his mottos elsewhere say, as I can. I think, again, there's that kind of historical consciousness was unusual among his contemporaries. And when I say his contemporaries, the two painters to whom he is most often compared and with whom he is discussed are Robert Campin, the so-called master of Flémal, and Roger van der Weyden, great contemporaries, neither of whom has left us a single signed or dated painting, right? The act of doing so and doing so persistently is very striking.
Thank you. Now we have a question from James Hall, who should unmute himself. Good evening, James.
Hello. Yes. Yeah. Fascinating talk and discussion. In relation to the idea of Van Eyck approving more of the sort of early Christians with their plain robes, I think in a way it's the opposite, and that certainly seems to be how Rogier van der Weyden responds to the luxury and the commerce that's so much a part of the Van Eyck's Madonna of Chancellor Rollin, because when he does his St. Luke drawing the Virgin, which is assumed to have been very much influenced by the Van Eyck, Van der Weyden removes virtually all the commerce in the background, a lot of the people, and it's much more austere and simplified. And I wonder, and also in his work generally, Van Eyck isn't really interested in doing shiny, reflective surfaces, or at least nowhere near as much as Van Eyck. And I wonder whether you think that my characterization of Van der Weyden responding very strongly to Van Eyck's work, but also critiquing it, is a correct one.
Thank you for that. I've thought a lot about that. Before I came to this Van Eyck book, more of my writing was about Roger van der Weyden, including a piece years and years ago in which it is about precisely that, the relationship between the St. Luke painting in Boston, which, for those not familiar with it, unquestionably is a kindred painting, a kindred composition to the Rollin Madonna. One of the two artists was looking at the other when he invented a different subject, a different individual in the presence of the Virgin. The standard assumption has always been that Roger van der Weyden was responding to the Rollin Madonna, and that may have been the case, but I have proposed neither of these paintings is dated. The Roger van der Weyden painting presumably was made for the Guild of Painters in Brussels. It was multiplied, it was copied, it was regarded as an effective composition, it presumably made for other painters' guilds in other cities. The Van Eyck painting went down to Autun. It was exported down to Rollin's hometown. So I would at least like to keep in play the possibility that Jan van Eyck actually responded to Roger van der Weyden. I will stick to that until it's proved impossible, as a possibility. To your more important point about a critique or about Jan van Eyck's different gear or different channel, more approving perhaps of wealth, if I'm following correctly. I think it's hard to deny. I think it's everywhere. And in fact, one of the most fascinating discoveries about this painting, and this is a discovery from the 1980s, the first significant infrared reflectograms made of this panel, which show us underdrawings of early Netherlandish paintings. We learn all kinds of things about decision-making, very prominently show that in the initial conception of the work on the panel, the right hip of Chancellor Rollin, there was a big money bag, a very elaborately depicted purse, right? It's not there in the painting. So best guess, to my mind, and to many people's mind, we just don't know. The best guess is that Jan van Eyck showed him the underdrawing, and we know that this was sometimes the process. It's what was called a vidimus in the 16th century. We have seen, the patron approves the work seen in an initial state. Best guess is that Rollin saw the money bag and thought, maybe that's not the best message for this bid for eternal salvation, right? Maybe there are other ways in which my wealth registers. Maybe that's a bit too much. But the idea that Van Eyck might have put it there first, I think would go to your suggestion that this is how he thinks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some questions in the chat. One from Jose Luis Gastanaga. Thank you for a great presentation. I have heard that Van Eyck's attention to detail came from his training work as a miniaturist illuminating manuscripts. Can you tell us something about this, or could you point to some publications on that topic?
Yes, thank you. A longstanding assumption, a longstanding guess, I should say, is that the early work that we wish we had, that we wish we knew about, was in fact as a manuscript painter, right? Illuminated manuscripts, painted manuscripts, among the most prized possessions at court, and in particular at the Burgundian court, an extraordinary library under Philip the Bold and his grandson Philip the Good, really an important part of the treasure of the property of the duchy. So the illuminated books, highly prized. Even if we didn't have any such books that might suggest the caliber of a painter like Jan van Eyck, we might guess that, given the character of his realism on these larger panel paintings. We do, however, have, sort of, a book called The Turin-Milan Hours, which is a famously complicated manuscript with a famously complicated afterlife. Begun in the 14th century, completed in the middle of the 15th century, different hands, different parts. It was divided, some of it burned, was destroyed, photographed. There is a group of illuminations within the Turin-Milan Hours that are Eyckian caliber paintings within a manuscript. The most important early scholar to work on this labeled these the hand G miniatures, ABC, numerous hands, numerous artists recognized. So many have long believed that that hand G was Jan van Eyck, that he was making manuscript illuminations before he began to make paintings like these, or in concert with earlier panel paintings that have since been lost. I've read an awful lot about it. I've looked at those carefully, and in fact, I include one of these remarkable paintings within the book in terms of the speculation about the early career. They are full of space and detail, space that is all the more remarkable for appearing on a page. For example, a great church interior is the one that it's a Mass of the Dead page from this Book of Hours that I illustrate in the book. Completely remarkable to have such a space, a compelling space within a book. I suppose I lean away from attribution to Jan van Eyck, based especially on the observations of my colleagues who work more closely with manuscripts and just my own sense of this, but they are certainly Eyckian. That's a very roundabout way of saying, yes, perhaps manuscript illumination. And in fact, later in his career, we have a record of him having paid for illuminations. Probably one of his jobs for the Duke was to be a kind of an art advisor, an art coordinator. He may have done purchasing for Philip the Good, including manuscripts and other illuminations.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time just for one last question, which is in the chat. So I'll read it from Abigail. It's interesting that both Mary and Gabrielle in the Virgin in the Church Annunciation have robes with a lot of bundled fabric at the front below the chest or waist. This looks to be the same with the wife of the Arnolfini portrait. Do you think this is indicative of wealth, of abundance, or of something else?
Yes. So wealth and abundance, I think so. I thought you were going to say what has often been said about Mrs. Arnolfini. Is she pregnant? And the general agreement is, if she isn't Mrs. Arnolfini, the general agreement is no. Given the fact that there is a convention within Eyckian painting and within other paintings of his Netherlandish colleagues of having these lavish materials pulled up in front of the body like that. So I believe that's the case. And I would say here too, whoever these people are, I'm going to continue to call them the Arnolfini. It's important to recognize that part of what would have looked remarkable to people is the very idea of such a picture. Portraiture already existed, but portraiture of two individuals in a contemporaneous space together as if in time, not abstracted from time, that was remarkable. And I think for them and for many observers, what they saw, might have seen first, is these people inside of two things that they own. They own this well-appointed home, and they own this painting by a famous painter, by Jan van Eyck, the painter to the Duke. So to your point about wealth, certainly addressed like that, the chandelier as well, and other elements here as well, those were all markers of wealth.
Okay, well, thank you. I think it's time to wrap up. So thank you, Al. Thank you, Rembrandt. That was really a feast for the eyes. I'm very grateful to the both of you, and thank you everyone for being there, for your contributions and questions. And we'll meet again at the end of the month for another session, this time on Dürer. And until then, all the best and good night.